Text Talks.
Hello and welcome to Text Talks. I'm Alex.
And I'm Katie.
And today we're going to be doing all about
Hinduism in the West.
Awesome.
Yeah, so I'm going to look at we're going to talk about two stages of Hinduism and how it came to be known in the West and how it exists in the West today. So we're going to start by pretty much its introduction to the West, so the first time people in the West really got to know what Hinduism is and what that's all about, and that was through Swami Vivekananda. Now, Vivekananda, who was born in 1863, was famous for his speaking at the World Parliament of Religions in Chicago in 1893. So we're going to come back to that in a little bit, but just so we know a little bit more about Vivekananda, after this he also travelled throughout Europe and America. He founded a few societies and delivered lots of speeches across the West, and that really introduced the West to Hinduism. So before we come back to some of the speeches and what he actually said, Alex, I know that you've studied the World Parliament of Religions a lot. Can you tell us a little bit about what it is?
Okay, so the World Parliament of Religions was held in 1893 in Chicago, and the idea of this parliament was to bring together scholars, Western scholars, Christian scholars, scientists, etc., with religions from around the world. And included in this was Swami Vivekananda with Hinduism and a couple of very famous Buddhist monks, one from Sri Lanka and one from Japan. And the purpose of this conference was to have discussions about interfaith dialogue about traditions and how they can conform today, well, at the time, with science, with reason, with rationality. You've got to remember that this was happening in the 1800s. So this is the end of the era of Enlightenment. So this is when rationality was a big player in Western civilization. You know, everyone wanted to be rational. And so you've got to bear this in mind when we start thinking about how Vivekananda spoke at the World Parliament of Religions. And I believe you've got a few quotes for us.
Yeah, so I've got a quote here, and I think this, we'll discuss it afterwards, but it definitely picks up on some of those themes, especially rationalism and the Enlightenment. So the quote goes, "Science is nothing but the finding of unity. As soon as science would reach perfect unity, it would stop from further progress, because it would reach the goal. Thus, chemistry could not progress farther when it would discover one element out of which all others could be made. Physics would stop when it would be able to fulfill its services in discovering one energy of which all the others are but manifestations, and the science of religion become perfect when it would discover Him, with a capital H, who is the one in a universe of death, Him who is the constant basis of an ever-changing world, one who is the only soul of which all souls are but delusive manifestations. Thus is it through multiplicity and duality that the ultimate unity is reached. Religion can go no farther. This is the goal of all science." So that's quite a long quote, and there's a lot going on here, and it talks a lot about science and stuff that I'm not particularly know that much about. So Alex, could you help us just unpack what's going on here?
Okay, well, I think there's a lot going on here. But the first thing to point out is when he's talking about this notion of Him with a capital H, what Vivekananda is referencing is Brahman, the universal ultimate principle in Hinduism that's linked to the Atman, which is each individual being's soul in quotation marks. But it's very interesting that he uses the word Him to start off with, because for those who've, explored Hinduism, okay, there are lots of different forms of divine, but Brahman tends to not be gendered. So in this instance, Vivekananda is using the word him with a capital H to try and almost synonymize Brahman with a Christian God. You've got to remember who his audience are.
Yeah, I was just about to say when I read that, it sounds very how, we in the West would understand the Abrahamic God. So it's kind of like the way he's talking about Brahman, which, as we've studied, we kind of try and do our best to disassociate that from the Abrahamic God, because we know it's slightly, it's different, much more all-encompassing, less personified deity or divinity. But yet here you get the impression that it is more like the Abrahamic God.
Yeah, and that's a deliberate move on Vivekananda's part. He knows who his target audience are. He knows what type of language, i.e. the language of science and of Christianity. Those are the two major things going on at the World Parliament of Religions. And he knows that if he's going to get Hinduism's message out there, he has to conform to some of the social rules that have been put in place by the people organising the conference. And this brings up, this idea of Orientalism, which, is a huge topic today, but it's basically where we either rationalise or romanticise aspects of Oriental traditions, so Hinduism being an Eastern tradition. And so Vivekananda was aware that his audience will have been trying to view whatever he was saying either through this rational lens or through this romanticised lens. And the angle that he's picked here is to go down the rational route. It's to play up to the Enlightenment period. It's to talk about science. It's to talk about this unity. And he's been very clever here. Right at the start of this quote, he says, "Science is nothing but the finding of unity." Now, the system of Hinduism that he is talking about, Vedanta, is also about finding unity. So he's immediately, without using any complex words from the Hindu tradition that his audience might not be aware of, he's already making science and Vedanta both have this same end goal, which is unity with him in capital letters.
And then right at the end, you've got, this is the goal of all science. And by all science at the end, he's just talked about chemistry, physics, and Hinduism. So he's lumping them all together. Yeah,
exactly. He is saying that, Hinduism is almost like the science of the soul. And so he's appealing to his audience. He's managing to get in the religious connotations of his tradition without ever distinctly saying that it's Hinduism. And that's very subtle, but it's all done on purpose to try and promote Hinduism to this new audience he's found.
Yeah, because those who have studied Hinduism before will notice that in that quote, there weren't any distinctly Hindu terms or Sanskrit terms. It's all very much in the language of Abrahamic religion, Western interest in rationalization. Yeah, he's very much speaking their language.
Well,
literally and symbolically or whatever.
Yeah, and if we hadn't told you at the start of this podcast, if we just started with reading that quote, you would have probably assumed it was a Christian scholar.
Definitely.
Because there's no indication, unless you know who it's coming from and why it's being said in the way it is, that it could be Christian easily, because he's completely nailed his target market.
And as you say, it is very clever, because this really did start the interest in Hinduism in the West. And I think when you said before, we talked about Orientalism, and part of that is this rationalizing of the religion to fit with the Enlightenment, but also romanticizing it. So we're going to talk a bit more in detail about that now, but I think it's an interesting concept more generally, because you see it all the time, the rationalization of the East, in quotation marks, and then very specifically in Hinduism, anytime Indian philosophy is talked about, it's always talked about in very kind of spiritual ways, and sometimes the implication is that it's not taken as seriously as Western philosophy in the West.
And that comes down to this Orientalist notion that the West is rational and that the East is mystical, and both have, some people argue, no, that's fine, because they both have one side of the same coin. We need both. And okay, yeah, we do need both romanticization and rationalism, but that's such a terrible view, really, of entire cultures. It's suggesting it's pinholing,
reductive of the ability of other countries who have these spiritual aspects to be rational thinkers. Our whole mathematical system is Arabic, right?
Yes, yeah. So it's Arabic, but then the Arabic system uses Sanskrit letters, so Sanskrit characters. So it's very reductive, like you say, to understand the East as mystical and the West as rational. And you can also talk about how the West hasn't always been fully rational either. You've got so many religious traditions. Okay, not many of them survive today. Not many of them are global religions, but that definitely aren't rational traditions.
And a very, very spiritual.
So not only is an Orientalist, view of the world as East and West being different, reductive, and not very good for understanding that the East also has a lot of rational thinking. It's also very reductive for the West in saying that we've only ever been rational. So much spiritual stuff has come out of the West too. So this is something that you've got to be really careful of when you start thinking about Hinduism and religion more generally, is this question of Orientalism and reason and rationalization.
So on that note, we're going to talk about yoga. So this is a hot topic when we're looking at Hinduism in the West, because it's everywhere. Yoga, you can't ignore it. It's even on, when I was doing some research for this podcast and the resources, it's even on the NHS website as an official, guide to yoga.
Wow.
Yeah, so if you look at the PowerPoint that accompanies this podcast, I've got a quote from there, and it's just interesting to know that that's in a very official, very, very secular domain that have talked about that. But of course, anyone who's listening, if you've studied yoga through Hinduism or through courses, you'll know about Bhakti Yoga, Karma Yoga, Jnana Yoga. So these are kind of the more ancient traditions of yoga, part of the spiritual ancient tradition. And I've got a quote here from the Bhagavad Gita talking about yoga, and it says, "There, having the mind actively focused upon a single point with thought and sense activity controlled, sitting on a seat, one should practice yoga for purification of the self. With an aligned body, head and neck, keeping these steady without movement, focusing the vision towards the tip of one's nose without looking in any direction."
So they're talking about yoga, but it's sitting, right?
Yeah, so you'll notice here that yoga maybe sounds a little bit more like what we know as meditation. It's sitting, it's focusing on the breath. And that's because when we talk about yoga, we need to distinguish the difference between yoga and asanas. So asana refers to postures. So when you get told about, downward dog and warrior pose, all that kind of thing, they're referring to asanas, so the postures that are associated within the yoga tradition. So yoga is way bigger than what the West understand it to be. It's not just, the postures and the kind of, an hour for every day working on that, watching a YouTube video.
It's not just stretching, right?
It's not just stretching. It's not, it's a whole spiritual tradition that can sometimes be postures, but also is a lot more than that. It's a lot of mental work and a lot of, attempting to attain enlightenment. And one of the reasons why these postures and asanas have become so popular is from Hatha Yoga, which came about around the 14th century and was the practice of yoga focusing on the asanas, the postures. But of course that's become more and more popular to the state we're in today, where in the West yoga is absolutely everywhere. There's a million products you can buy relating to it. And so now I'm going to talk about the Hindu American Foundation, which is an American group that are keen on advocating for or educating the West about Hinduism, to create more respect for Hindus in America in particular, and promote their well-being for having that respect. And one of their big movements has been campaigning against the commercialization of yoga in the West. And so I've got a quote here from their page, and they say, "The commercialization is problematic in general, but it is of particular concern to Hindus who see yoga being delinked from its roots. And though yoga is a means of spiritual attainment for any and all seekers, irrespective of faith or no faith, its underlying principles are those of Hindu thought. For Hindus in America who are faced with caste, cow and karma stereotypes in public school textbooks and mass media, the acknowledgement of yoga as a tremendous contribution of ancient Hindus to the world is important. This acknowledgement is not to imply ownership of yoga. No one owns yoga. Rather, it is an appreciation of the richness and universality of the Hindu teachings." So what the Hindu American Foundation is arguing here, that, okay, yoga can be enjoyed by a lot of people, and, as long as it's respected, people can practice yoga. But the way that people make money from it and commodify it, so lots of products, or even novelty products, and make jokes about yoga from non-Hindu businesses, are profiting, in fact, from yoga. But it's every time that happens, it gets moved further and further away from its spiritual links, and that's problematic, because then you're losing what it is to Hinduism, and also, the ancient tradition of yoga, which, as we said before, is so much bigger than just the postures.
So it's becoming rationalized, to use the language we were talking about before. It's becoming rationalized, and in that process, it's losing its romantic quality, or just everything else attached to it. We're kind of pigeonholing it. We're seeing yoga as this one thing, which is get fit. Or, get fit whilst focusing on your breath. But actually, the yoga tradition is so much more than this. And that's what the Hindu Foundation is arguing, that we should try and understand everything about yoga, rather than just going in blindly, taking this one thing from it and then running away with it and commodifying it.
Yeah, that's exactly it. But also, what this quote doesn't show, that yoga, as much as it is rationalised and, great, let's get fit with yoga, really healthy, because of course it is really healthy, but it is also romanticised, because, to do yoga, people might assume you're a bit spiritual, or, a bit in touch with the spiritual side and that kind of thing, and that can be very appealing in the same way with if you meditate, if you practice mindfulness, it kind of hints towards more a spirituality, which is definitely romanticised in the West in the way that the East is romanticised.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that comes down to movements in the 60s and the New Age movement in the 70s. Yoga was a very visible form of people practicing spirituality, and a lot of different New Age religions took parts of yoga and tried to push it into their own spirituality. So now it's kind of been shifted into that sphere since then. And so you've got these two strands. You've got this very rationalized yoga that you do in the gym, but you've also still got a lot of these New Age spiritual groups that have aspects of yoga incorporated in with them. And I think books or films like Men Who Stare at Goats have done a lot to romanticize yoga. So if anyone's seen this, it's the film with Ewan McGregor and George Clooney, and it's about the 1st Earth Battalion, which was an actual military initiative in the 70s in America, that was based on psychological warriors, people who had telepathic powers, could run through walls, etc. And a lot of that, the basis for that was off yogic practices, because there's a book called the Yoga Sutra, which, 3/4 of it doesn't talk about magic powers, but 1/4 of it does, and that's...
Of course, that's what we like to talk about then. When you talk about yoga, it's but this one book says that you can gain all these magic powers and walk through walls.
Exactly. And so you can see that, that we've got these two strands of yoga today that are actually both completely different from what yoga was or is in India. It's been removed from its spiritual practice, either by being heightened to the level of New Age movement understandings of yoga, or it's been completely secularized and rationalized by, gym yoga.
Yeah, so it's a really interesting thing to think about, and also when you encounter yoga, the Hindu American Foundation literally say no one owns yoga and there's no one person that should or shouldn't be practicing it, but it's just making sure that we all respect it and understand its greater tradition, which if you're listening to this podcast or if you're studying Hinduism, you are. So that's great, but it only takes scrolling through social media or looking online to see how many products there are out there and how many products really problematically forget its religious background or spiritual background. So when I was looking for examples for the PowerPoint, I came across things like a pun on namaste, but namaste in bed. And okay, people who practice yoga maybe sometimes don't want to get up, fair enough, we all do, and want to stay in bed, making a pun on that, but namaste is literally a greeting to the divine, so a pun on that is actually really problematic. But there's just so much stuff that, because yoga is so commercialized and it's everywhere in the West, people think that it's okay to make puns and take ownership of the tradition.
And I think that's also the case for other aspects of Hinduism more generally as well. I mean, I'm thinking of this example of a t-shirt that said, "Follow your karma."
Yeah.
Which, if you
know what karma means, that doesn't make any sense. But just to contextualize that, karma is literally what you acquire according to your actions. You can't
follow that. It's a generating
karma
process.
Yeah.
So it's not like fate. It's not written for you already. Karma is generated as you do actions. So how can you possibly follow that without...
If anything, it follows you.
Yeah.
Which would be a really great, reminder. Karma follows you. That's quite... but yeah, I mean, it's everywhere, and it really is, I think, the West, becoming interested in certain ideas from Hinduism, but then subtly taking ownership or trying to take ownership and then making money from it, commodifying it. And it's just something that, if you listen to our podcast, this is something we talk about a lot, but just being very, very aware of how we're talking about things and, learning more and more is just a great start.
Yeah, and I think that's all you can do, and at least if you're starting to make that effort in learning, where did yoga come from? Try and read an Upanishad. You might not understand it, but give it a go. At least you're trying to engage with the tradition, and then go and do your hatha yoga practice. Yeah,
and also just knowing that it's, when you're practicing yoga, you're practicing the asanas, you're practicing hatha yoga, and knowing that where you are within this all-encompassing ancient tradition, knowing what exactly from it you're taking.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Katie. That was really insightful. If you've got any questions about yoga, about Vivekananda, about Hinduism in the West more generally, feel free to contact us on Facebook at Text Talks or on Twitter at Text Talks 1.
Thanks for listening.